We'll give it. Perfect. That's also what I was waiting for. So, thank you for joining us today to hear from Ambassador Michelle Gavin. And I am going to hand off the introduction to Ambassador Mark Stravella from Pardee today to introduce our speaker.
Okay, well, listen, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Rodney seminar series, and an incredible, honestly, a delight to introduce Ambassador Michelle Gavin. Ambassador Gavin is right now the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for African Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. But she's done so much more, and she is a great example of a scholar practitioner. Most notably, from 2011 to 2014, Ambassador Gavin was ambassador to Botswana, where she and I served in Africa, right next door to one another, and were pals then. And she was also the U.S. representative to SADC, the Southern African Development Community. I did not know this, but you arranged for SADC to organize a military exercise involving the United States. I'm not sure had that ever happened before. Senior Director for Africa. Senior Africa person in the U.S. government, with the possible exception of the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. While she was there, she oversaw a number of interesting things, including the initiation of YALI, Young African Leaders Initiative. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, she also is the principal author of a speech given by Barack Obama in Ghana, which to this day I think is one of the best statements of American policy toward Africa. And I quote it often to this day. Prior to that, she also worked in the United States Senate for Russ Feingold. That's right. And I don't remember which position you had there, but you were doing African affairs or all international relations?
All the foreign policy work.
All foreign policy.
But he was in Africa.
Yes.
Senate.
Yes. Was he the
chair ranking member of the subcommittee, depending on who had the majority?
Yep. Ambassador Gavin was previously a Rhodes Scholar, and for that studied at Georgetown. And
same year, same class.
You didn't say, oh yes.
Yes, yes.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. And if you'll permit, I think she's still one of the leading thinkers on Africa in the United States. So with that,
thank you so much.
Delighted to turn it over to you.
Well, now I am set up to be deeply disappointing. That was a lovely introduction, though. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me here. It's really a treat for me. I particularly like going to universities, in part because I've been spending so much time lately thinking about people, about the age of the average university student. So it's illuminating for me to hear what's on young people's minds here, because I've spent so much time trying to figure out what's on young people's minds on the African continent. Few disclaimers. I do not claim to be an expert on all of the incredibly diverse, complex, varied African states. It's impossible, I think. Where my expertise really lies is in how the US government tends to think about Africa. So I just want to make sure no one thinks I'm trying to position myself as this authoritative figure about a whole continent. That said, I went ahead and I took the plunge recently to write a book that does aim to talk about most of the continent. And here's the big idea. The big idea is that there is a tremendous amount of political change coming in Africa. And that is kind of a bold statement to make in light of, say, the last 10 days, right? Where you've got Paul Biya being elected for his 8th term in office in Cameroon. 8th term in office. I traveled to Cameroon when I was an undergraduate at Georgetown. He had already been president for a dozen years when I got there. Look at me now, right? With the gray hair and the wrinkles, he's still the president. It's incredible. And we've also seen, President Ouattara reelected for a constitutionally very questionable additional term in Cote d'Ivoire. And in Tanzania, we've seen the president elected with some 97% of the vote after, as in Cote d'Ivoire, as in Cameroon, her most prominent opponents were banned from running for office for various legal reasons of dubious legitimacy. So that sort of speaks to, I think, this era of stasis that we've seen in much of the continent politically, while these societies have been very dynamic below that political leadership level. So we've had these long-serving leaders like the Bias, the Obiangs. You've had the dominant political parties, particularly in Southern Africa, the the Frelimos, the MPLAs, certainly ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. And you've had systems that sort of transfer power among different political elites in ways such that the transfer of power results in very little change on the ground in terms of policy. And I think both Nigeria and Kenya are great examples of that. So there's been this era of consistency that I think is very, in parts of the continent, already in the rearview mirror and going to be there soon for the rest of it. And so why do I think this is the case when we've seen these, just recently, these 3 countries, at least for today, the status quo is hanging on. I think it's inevitable for kind of 4 big reasons. And one is just the unbelievably youthful demographics of the continent, right? We're all used to hearing how young Africa is, but it's worth spending a second to recognize how different this demographic profile is from things that we've seen before and might think are good comparisons. So when I first set out to write this book about political change, the head of studies at CFR said, you're going to need to really dive in to the 1960s in the US, where youth movements were a really prominent force. You had that big generation coming to the fore at the time of a lot of debates about Vietnam, et cetera, as social mores were changing. Yes, super interesting time, right? 1968 was a very interesting year in US history. In 1968, the portion of the US population, excluding children, excluding the little ones, but including sort of 15 and up, so politically aware, the portion that was 15 to 24 out of all of the rest of the adults in the US was about 23%. It was really big. That's why they call them baby boomers. It's this huge generation moving through. In 2011, in Egypt, during the Arab Spring, right, which many people point to as an example of kind of youth-led questioning of political orthodoxy, the portion of Egyptians relative to the rest of the adult Egyptian population was more like 32%, almost a third, really big. Most African countries, at least a dozen, it's over 60%, in some cases over 70%. So when you talk about a public opinion survey in Congo or in Nigeria, you are talking about a youth survey. It's just that much bigger than the rest of the adult population, that young cohort. And this really matters. It matters because when we think about societies that are dominated by youth, the optimists among us always want to lean into the East Asian parallel, right? This happened too in Asia, and they had a massive economic boom because of it, their demographic dividend. Well, first of all, the numbers were nowhere near as overwhelming in East Asia in terms of population skewing in. Secondly, that reference is to a totally different part of the demographic transition when the portion of the population in the labor force is really big, and there's just a tiny bit of the population that are dependents, either children or the elderly. And that's not what these African societies look like, right? The population pyramids are very wide and flat. So there are a lot of dependents for everyone in the labor force, but more importantly, there are nowhere near enough jobs for everyone in the labor force. African economic growth, even in the big growth stories, your Cote d'Ivoire, your Mozambique, it's not been commensurate with job creation. So you still have tremendous amounts of society working in the informal sector. This is not a recipe for political stability. And we'll talk more about that. So the first thing is, wow, this is an incredibly youth heavy place. Then it's really important to recognize too that the other interesting demographic change is how rapidly Africa is urbanizing. So we're just a few years out from the point where more Africans will live in urban centers than not. And this is so important for politics. So if you think about the urban experience, it's much easier to organize politically when you're in the city. It's much easier to push back against sort of divide and conquer strategies about the other in your maybe very diverse state, because typically urban centers are sort of more cosmopolitan. You're living side by side with that other who may have a different linguistic, regional, religious background. Your sense of relative deprivation is sharpened in a city, because while you may be living in an informal settlement with very few public services, you can see in that same city how the other half lives. Not the other half, it's the 1%. You can see exactly how they live. And I think that contributes to what we see in a lot of polling around the continent, which is that, and remember, public opinion surveys in a lot of these states are youth surveys, which is a tremendous amount of concern about corruption and anger about it. So we have young people increasingly in cities. And even if you had a magic wand and you could stop rural to urban migration right now, the cities would continue to grow because of just natural population growth. This is, Africa's future is urban. Then, third factor is just digitization and the ease of communication that comes in our digital age. So this also speaks to the issues of relative deprivation. Not only can you locally see how the elites of your society live, you can also see what life looks like in neighboring countries around the world. And you can, this leads to questions about why opportunities are so limited where you are. It also really changes the game in terms of political organizing. And then the fourth factor is really about this particular historical moment in which we find ourselves. So if the prevailing political narratives across the continent tend to be anchored in a specific historical period, usually of decolonization or liberation, sometimes of the end to a terrible period of instability or political violence. And let's take some examples just to let's put some meat on these bones. So the most obvious one is South Africa, right? That people have kind of heard about and thought about. Oh, how long does the ANC campaign as if the choice before the voter were to choose the ANC or choose back to apartheid? Because that's what their campaigns have looked like. But increasingly, you have a larger and larger portion of South Africans who have no lived experience of apartheid. And this is not the world's most compelling campaign message. In Zimbabwe, they have elections, but the real political narrative in Zimbabwe about why ZANU-PF wins elections isn't really about getting the most votes. It's about who delivered Zimbabwe from white minority rule. And if you look at quotes from senior ZANU-PF officials, they'll talk about why ZANU-PF will be ruling forever in Zimbabwe, and it's that reason. But again, most Zimbabweans weren't born during white minority rule. And so you sort of ask yourself, how long does this keep working? Uganda is another great example where President Museveni, right, he's been in power since 1986. And it took a long time for multi-party politics to come to Uganda, a very long time. The wave of democratization that sort of washed over the continent post-Cold War was resisted for a long time in Uganda. But there too, the prevailing narrative is not everybody votes for me because my policies are so good. It's, you know, I am the bulwark that stands between you and going back to the past, to the Amin and Obote years of tremendous political violence and instability. So a lot of the campaigning messages are about retaining our security. He spends a lot of time with the military. There's an anecdote in the book that I love where he's celebrating his birthday as he gets older, and he's at the site of a famous battle from when the NRM, his movement, was seizing control of Uganda, and the cake is decorated with camouflage icing. And these, those edible photos you can put on a cake, and these photos of, soldiers in the prone position with their rifles. These are the images he wants associated with himself in, the 2020s. It's been a while since the NRM took control. And so I do think, these narratives are really past their sell-by date. And there are new narratives that young people are devising that challenge them. So I just gave you some examples on the kind of historical inflection point piece. If we think about digitization and how that helps with organization, Kenya is a great example. The last 2 summers of Gen Z protests organized almost entirely online. And that made it much more difficult to suppress because there wasn't sort of one clear opposition figure who could be co-opted or arrested to put a stop to it. For urbanization, just consider what's happened in Madagascar, which I find totally fascinating. So Madagascar has urbanized really rapidly. It used to be a dominantly rural society. But as more and more people have moved to the city, and there's been almost no investment in basic urban infrastructure, right? Affordable housing, sanitation, water, power, transportation. So if you have a job, you could actually get to it. All the things that you need to make a city functional aren't there. And the dissatisfaction of that young urban population has bubbled over into the movement we just saw that ousted their president. It's really interesting to me because, yes, Madagascar has a history of coups, and it's absolutely true that countries that have a history of military seizures of power are more likely to see that happen again. And in fact, the president who was ousted came to power in a coup. But what's so interesting to me is that this was not, when he came to power, it was very clear that he was challenging the existing regime, and the military came along to support him for their own interests. What happened this time is different. It did not originate from elites in the military or in political circles or in the Malagasy economy. This drive for change originated from young people in urban centers who were absolutely furious about water and power cuts and very quickly turned to this government's got to go. So we see all this happening in real time, week by week. And what I think is really interesting in terms of thinking about the future is that it's not going to be one change, right? It's going to be a cycle, because I think no matter how well-intentioned, how brilliant, how ethically sound any new government is, I have yet to meet anyone who tells me how these states are going to meet the job creation imperative before them. Where are all these jobs going to come from? And particularly, where are they going to come from when there is such incredibly limited fiscal space for government maneuver, right? So let's think about Zambia, because we have an expert in the room. So when President Hichilema was elected, the current president of Zambia was elected, it was in a youth-fueled movement that was fed up with particularly corruption and the lack of job opportunity under the previous government. And, Hichilema had been, I think this was his 5th time running, long time opposition figure, but he kind of hitched his political wagon to this youth frustration, and it worked, despite very significant state repression. So he comes into office, and, Zambia's already defaulted on its debt during the COVID pandemic. They're already in sort of fiscal disarray. And what does he find? He finds the debt is even worse than they thought it was. There was secret debt that was owed to China. The same thing happened to the new Senegalese government. It's even worse than they thought. So they're trying to deal with debt restructuring. They're trying to service these debts, right? They're trying to keep their head above water. There is no space for the kinds of big job-creating stimulus programs you might imagine if you were the head of a country for which job creation is an existential imperative. There's just no money to do it. And so I think what we'll see is, even in the best situations where popular will asking for change leads to something new, there will be a period of hope, followed quickly by a period of disappointment. And that disappointment feeds right back into the grievance base that is driving this demand for change. And that grievance base, I don't know if any of you got a chance to read UNDP's really excellent report about the military takeovers we've seen in the last 5 years or so. They did some great polling in states that experience these, and in states that are usually considered to have pretty strong democracy. And what was so interesting in the Sahelian states, all of the coup states that they worked in, with the exception of Sudan, and it's very obvious why that would be the exception, we can talk about it. All of the polling suggested that for young people who supported the junta, at least initially, the number one reason was time for a change. That's it. They saw this as a vehicle that could deliver some alternative political system, even if they weren't particularly previously inclined to be enthusiastic about military governance. And there you can see too, as polling goes on, that the enthusiasm for these new leaders fades pretty quickly when they're unable to deliver what they promised, which is addressing the security situation in the case of the Sahelian states, right? And creating economic opportunity. And so the grievance base sort of reconstitutes itself in different forms. We definitely see that in Guinea, for example. And so this idea of kind of cycles of euphoria when some change occurs, leading to disappointment, I think that's actually what we've been seeing for a while in the places that have not been experiencing stasis. So you may remember the sort of paranoia in the US around the number of Russian flags that were seen in the celebrations that followed military seizures of power in Burkina or in Niger. I looked up a lot of that media coverage, which all begins with, the youth were in the streets, the horns were honking, the flags were waving. What's so funny to me is that in those exact places, if you look up the coverage from the day the ousted civilian leader was elected, you get the exact same thing. Everybody was in the streets, everyone was honking, change had come, we have a new leader. It's easy to sort of misinterpret the enthusiasm for change as an appetite for a specific form of governance or even a specific leader. But I really think that's a mistake. We can talk about, Burkina and the kind of latter-day Sankara posturing of their Junta leader, Traore, and how that gets amplified by others. But I really just don't think if you're Burkinabe and you're dealing still with tremendous insecurity and completely insufficient economic opportunity, I don't think, you can't eat anti-colonial rhetoric any more than you can eat democracy. So what does all of that kind of mean for the US or for other kind of external actors who will be affected by instability, who need to care about African partnerships to solve big global problems? I think it means some pretty, I think it calls for some soul searching around democracy and the way we talk about it. So our current government doesn't appear to be very interested in talking about democracy at all overseas. And in fact, there's been guidance, right, given to our diplomats not to comment on election integrity unless otherwise instructed. But if you care about democracy as an idea and see it not as an American imperial project, but rather as kind of a human project, or you believe that based on the evidence, it's the best form of governance you've seen, democracy has a hugely tarnished brand on the continent because of things like calling Paul Biya's reelection, a democratic choice. It's not a democratic choice because Cameroon's not a democracy. They have elections, right? But the rule of law does not apply the same way to everybody. Journalists are not free to say what they wish to say. His most prominent opponents were not free to run in this election. And the integrity of the electoral exercise itself is certainly not one most people have confidence in. I recall not this time, but I think it was the last time around, finding this interesting YouTube press conference in the wake of Paul Biya's, I guess, would be 7th reelection, in which delegates from Transparency International were extolling the integrity of the exercise and the transparency. And what was so funny was that Transparency International had no team on the ground at all during those elections. It was literally completely concocted, pure theater, just fake. Just hire some people, create a name placard, put it in front of them, have a press conference. And this is sort of, I think, a great example of the window dressing and the theater that democracy has become associated with in so many of these societies. It's about having an election day and having an electoral commission, and everybody is play acting. And when we or others congratulate these countries on their democratic exercise and, call for just everybody to, if you had any questions, please pursue them through the courts, which are not independent, we are complicit, right, in this play acting. And I think it's a huge problem for democracy. I also think it's a problem for us. So that brings me to my second of my kind of 4 conclusions from all this, which is that this whole phenomenon is a real recipe for resentment of the status quo. And if you happen to be the country that has been the most powerful country in the world throughout the post-war Cold War era, it is only natural that a lot of that resentment would be directed your way. And I can't tell you how many discussions and interviews I've done in which very thoughtful young people from very different parts of the continent talk about the structural inequalities in our international institutional architecture, right? Whether it's representation of United Nations Security Council or in the international financial institutions, whether it's about the way we assess risk on the continent, the fact that Africa contributed very little to our current climate crisis, but is experiencing tremendous negative effects from more intense periods of drought and rain. All of these things are so deep. They don't seem deeply unfair. They are deeply unfair. But here's the leap then that I think gets made, which is that all of these things are deeply unfair, and we end up with the short end of the stick. And this is so because the most powerful country in the world wishes for it to be so. And it's very hard to say, well, it is kind of happenstance that we ended up here. It's not like a cabal got together in Washington and sat down and said, let's figure out how to make sure Africa, is forever coping with resource scarcity or the consequences of our actions. But that is the way the world works. And if you look at the resentment that's been directed at France and most of its former colonies, I think there's an element to that that's about the fact that France seems like the most powerful external actor in those places for such a long time. And the status quo in those places is unjust. And it's very easy to get angry. So I think that is a deeply held sense of resentment in many places. And I also think that it is deliberately fanned and exploited by rivals of the United States. So China is very happy to lean into this particular narrative. And so are some of the Russian-backed social media influencers who are prominent throughout the continent. Third, I think that this desperate desire for change, this frustration with the status quo, the volatility, political volatility we're likely to see, means that the prescription we've gotten from the current administration, which is really for transactionalism, let's just go cut some deal, is a bad fit, because you cut deals with elites. that's the kind of deal making we're talking about. We're going to get some, whatever, the president's daughter's father-in-law on a plane with some other people, and we're going to make some deals with President Tshisekedi and President Kagame. But I think the political ground, certainly that Tshisekedi stands on, is not so firm. And I have real questions about what happens in Rwanda post President Kagame, who has, no clear successor. And so we end up kind of pinning our entire policy on elites who may be headed out a revolving door very soon. And I think that's a big mistake. We also ally ourselves with a status quo that is the target of resentment, unable to deliver what the population demands, and in many cases, Congo, a good example, engaged in corrupt practices that are well known and well discussed, particularly in a digital age, particularly in an urban age where demonstrations can let you know that, oh, everybody knows the emperor has no clothes. It's not just me. And then the last thing I'll say is that for the crowd I tend to spend a lot of time with, people thinking about how the U.S. thinks about Africa, the lesson we really need to take to heart is that ultimately the drivers of the political future of the entire region, with its totally different political economies and histories, it's going to be these youthful populations. It's not going to be China. It's not going to be Russia. It's not even going to be these deep-pocketed Gulf states who are making such a huge difference in the security dynamics of East Africa right now. It really is going to be about these kinds of insatiable demands for dignified jobs, for accountable government, and spending a bunch of time being afraid of Chinese engagement can lead us to miss the point that young people are risking their lives to make every day on the continent. So I'll wrap there because that's a lot of me talking, but I hope the Q&A is always the best part. So I hope people